You don't serve me. You survive me. The sentence didn't echo. It sliced, clean and deliberate, through the low hum of conversation, through the clinking of crystal glasses and the soft piano drifting from the corner of the room. And just like that, the entire restaurant shifted its weight toward table 12, where Daniel Whitmore sat like a man who had never once been told no, his tailored navy suit catching the amber glow of the chandelier above. His posture relaxed, but his eyes sharp, watching, measuring, waiting for the next person to fail him. The waitress standing in front of him hesitated for half a second too long, and that was all it took, her smile faltering as she stepped back, murmuring an apology that never quite landed, before turning away, her heels quieter than before as she disappeared into the kitchen, leaving behind a silence thicker than the imported steak resting untouched on his plate. Daniel didn't react, not outwardly. He simply adjusted his cufflinks and leaned back in his chair, as if dismissing her required no more effort than breathing. But the message was already clear to everyone watching. This wasn't a table you served. It was a table you endured, and one by one. The staff had learned that lesson the hard way. The manager approached next, forced composure painted across his face, his voice low, careful, as though speaking too loudly might trigger something worse. Sir, perhaps we can assign. But Daniel raised a single finger, not looking at him, not needing to, and the manager stopped mid-sentence, the air between them tightening. Because in this room, power didn't shout. It paused, and when it did, people listened. Around them, conversations resumed in fragments, quieter now, eyes flicking back toward table 12, curiosity wrapped in caution, because everyone here understood something unspoken. Money filled the room, but control belonged to the man who could silence it. Behind the polished bar, a line of waitstaff stood still, not frozen, but calculating, each one aware of the invisible boundary that had formed around that table, a line no one wanted to cross again. And yet the shift wasn't over, the night wasn't done, and someone would have to step forward eventually. The manager exhaled slowly, glancing toward the kitchen doors as they swung open just slightly, enough to reveal movement behind them, shadows crossing under fluorescent light, the quiet choreography of a staff trying to avoid a problem that refused to go away. We're out of options, someone whispered, barely audible, but it didn't need to be louder, because the truth of it settled quickly. No one wanted that table, not anymore. And then, almost unnoticed at first, a figure stepped through the doors, not rushed, not hesitant, just steady, measured, as if the tension in the room hadn't reached her yet. Zariah Cole adjusted the cuff of her sleeve as she moved forward, her uniform as crisp as the others, her posture straight, her expression unreadable in a way that didn't ask for permission or forgiveness. She didn't glance at the staff lined up along the wall, didn't look toward the manager waiting for eye contact that never came. She simply walked, each step quiet but certain against the polished floor, until the distance between her and table 12 began to close. Daniel noticed before anyone else did, not because she made a sound, but because she didn't, his gaze lifting slightly, curious in the way a man becomes when something doesn't follow the pattern he's already mastered. And for the first time that night, he didn't look bored, he looked interested. Zariah stopped at the edge of the table, not too close, not too far. The perfect distance where presence could not be ignored but still respected the illusion of control, and for a brief moment, neither of them spoke, the silence stretching just enough to make the surrounding room lean in again, forks pausing midair, conversations dissolving into background noise. Daniel tilted his head slightly, studying her, expecting the same nervous energy, the same rehearsed politeness, the same inevitable misstep that would confirm what he already believed about people in her position. But Zariah didn't fill the silence. She let it exist, steady and unbroken, and somehow that changed the shape of the moment. The manager watched from a distance, pulse quickening, because something about this felt different, not safer, not easier, just different, like a shift no one had planned for. Daniel finally spoke, his voice calm, almost amused. You understand what this table requires. And for the first time that night, the question didn't sound like a test. It sounded like a warning. Zariah met his gaze without hesitation, her voice even, quiet enough that it didn't disturb the room, but clear enough that it didn't need to. Yes, sir. she said, not rushing the words, not softening them, just stating them as fact. And in that moment, something subtle but undeniable moved through the space between them, something that didn't belong to him anymore, something he couldn't quite name yet, but felt all the same. Because this time, the story wasn't starting the way it usually did. Daniel did not reach for the menu, did not gesture, did not offer her the usual opening that allowed a server to perform their script. Instead, he leaned back slightly, fingers resting against the edge of the table as though the entire room existed for his observation. And for a brief second, he let the silence stretch again, testing whether she would rush to fill it like the others had. But Zariah did not move. She did not fidget. She simply stood with a stillness that felt intentional, like someone who understood that control was not always loud, and that alone shifted something in the air. Daniel's lips curved into the faintest hint of a smile, not warm, not kind, but curious, the kind of expression a man wears when a pattern begins to break. Then let us begin with something simple, he said, his tone almost conversational now, as though the previous tension had never happened, yet every word carried weight. I will have the chef prepare something that is not on your menu, something from a region most people here could not even pronounce, and I want it served exactly the way it would be there, not your version, not your interpretation. He paused just long enough to let the impossibility settle, then added, and I will know the difference. A quiet challenge, carefully placed. A few feet away, the manager stiffened, already anticipating the outcome, because this was how it always started, an unreasonable request disguised as refinement, followed by disappointment that no one could avoid. But Zariah did not look toward the kitchen, did not hesitate. She simply nodded once, precise and measured. Understood, she said, her voice carrying the same calm as before, not louder, not softer, just steady. And then she turned without another word, walking back toward the kitchen doors with the same unhurried pace she had arrived with. Behind her, the tension did not dissolve. It shifted, curiosity replacing certainty, because something about her response had not fit the pattern they all knew too well. Inside the kitchen, the noise returned in a rush, pans clattering, voices overlapping, the controlled chaos of a high-end restaurant trying to maintain perfection. But when Zariah stepped in, the volume seemed to lower, not because anyone told it to, but because presence has a way of doing that. She moved directly toward the head chef, leaning in just enough to speak without disrupting the room. Her words quick, specific, leaving no space for confusion. And within seconds the chef's expression changed from irritation to focus, as if the request had been translated into something possible rather than impossible. Back in the dining room, Daniel watched the doors close behind her, his fingers tapping once against the table, a subtle rhythm, thoughtful rather than impatient. And for the first time that evening he did not scan the room for distraction. He waited. Minutes passed, not long enough to disrupt the flow of the restaurant, but long enough for attention to settle again, for nearby tables to glance over under the pretense of casual curiosity. And then the doors opened. Zariah returned carrying a single plate, not elaborate, not oversized, but precise, every element placed with intention, the kind of detail that did not ask for approval, it assumed it. She set it down in front of him without flourish, without commentary, allowing the presentation to speak before she did. And then, only then, she met his gaze again. Prepared as requested, she said. Daniel looked down at the plate, his expression unreadable for a moment. Then he leaned forward slightly, examining the details, the arrangement, the balance, and something in his posture shifted, not dramatically, not enough for anyone else to notice, but enough for him. He picked up his fork, paused, then took a bite, the room around him holding its breath in a way no one acknowledged. He did not react immediately. He chewed slowly, thoughtfully, as if measuring not just the taste but the intention behind it. And when he finally set the fork down, he did not dismiss it. He did not critique it. He simply said, "That is correct." 3 words, quiet, controlled, but heavier than anything he had said all night. A murmur moved through the room, subtle but undeniable, because this was not how the story usually went, and Daniel knew it too. His eyes lifting back to Zariah, studying her again, this time not as a server, not as part of the background, but as a variable he had not accounted for. "Tell me," he said, his tone no longer amused but genuinely interested. How did you know? And Zariah did not smile, did not soften. She answered the same way she had done everything else, directly. Because you were not asking for the dish, she said, her voice even. You were testing whether anyone here understood it. And for the first time that evening, Daniel Whitmore did not have a response ready, because the game he thought he was controlling had just revealed a rule he had not written. The words settled between them, not loud, not dramatic, but precise, and precision had a way of unsettling people who were used to controlling the room, because it did not ask for permission, it simply existed, and Daniel Whitmore felt it. The subtle shift that did not come from volume but from accuracy, his gaze narrowing slightly as he leaned forward again, this time not to dominate but to understand, because what stood in front of him no longer fit the role he had assigned, and when something breaks expectation, it demands attention. Around them, the restaurant resumed its rhythm, but not entirely. There was a difference now, a quiet awareness that something unusual was unfolding at table 12, a tension that no longer came from fear but from curiosity, because the pattern had already cracked once, and people were waiting to see if it would happen again. Daniel rested his hand against the table, tapping once, then stilling it as if deciding on his next move carefully. Most people, he said slowly, his tone thoughtful rather than dismissive, would have answered the question I asked. He lifted his eyes to meet hers again. You answered the one I did not. And there was no mockery in his voice now, only interest, controlled but real. Zariah did not shift her stance, did not lean in, did not retreat. She held the same steady presence that had already altered the direction of the evening. People usually hear what they expect, she replied, her voice calm, not what is actually being said. And again, the simplicity of the statement carried more weight than anything elaborate could have, because it did not try to impress. It revealed. Daniel exhaled quietly, not frustrated, not impressed in the obvious way, but recalibrating, because this was no longer a predictable exchange, and unpredictability, to a man like him, was not a threat. It was a puzzle, and puzzles were meant to be solved. He reached for his glass, taking a slow sip, eyes never fully leaving her, as though even a second of distraction might cause him to miss something important, and when he set it down, the decision was already made. Very well, he said, his voice returning to that composed authority, but now layered with something sharper, something more deliberate. Let us continue. He gestured lightly toward the empty space on the table. I would like a recommendation. He paused just enough to clarify. Not from the menu. Another test, but this time it was different, not designed to humiliate, but to explore. Zariah inclined her head slightly, acknowledging the request without rushing to fill it, her eyes scanning the table for a brief moment. Not the menu, not the surroundings, but the details that most people overlooked, the untouched bread, the placement of the utensils, the way he had eaten only a portion of the dish before stopping, and then she spoke. You prefer balance over excess, she said, not as a guess, but as an observation, something structured, but not predictable. And for a fraction of a second, Daniel's expression shifted again, not dramatically, but enough to confirm she had not guessed, she had seen. A faint murmur rippled from a nearby table, quickly silenced, because now it was clear that this was no longer about service. This was something else entirely, something quieter but far more compelling. Daniel leaned back slightly, folding his hands together as if conceding the floor, a rare gesture for someone who usually controlled every second of interaction. Go on, he said. Zariah did not hesitate this time, not because she was eager, but because she had already decided. The chef can prepare a course inspired by northern coastal cuisine, she explained, her tone even, light, precise, layered. It will match what you are actually looking for, not what you initially asked for. And there it was again, that distinction. The difference between request and intention, between surface and substance. Daniel studied her for a long moment, longer than before, because now the question was no longer whether she could meet his standards, but how far beyond them she could go. And that was not a position he found himself in often. And if you are wrong, he said quietly, not as a threat, but as a final measure. Zariah met his gaze without flinching. Then it will still be the best decision made at this table tonight, she answered. not with arrogance, but with certainty, and certainty, when it is real, does not need to be loud. The air around them tightened again, not with tension this time, but with anticipation, because everyone within earshot understood that something had shifted permanently, that the balance of control was no longer one-sided, and Daniel Whitmore, for the first time that evening, did not immediately respond, because somewhere between the first challenge and this moment, the game had changed, and he was no longer the only one who understood how it was being played. The decision hung in the air for only a second longer before Daniel gave the slightest nod, not dramatic, not performative, just enough to signal that the moment had moved forward, and Zariah turned once again toward the kitchen, her pace unchanged, her posture steady, as if nothing about this exchange had required effort. Yet behind her, the entire room felt it, the shift from expectation to anticipation, because now it was no longer about whether she could handle him. It was about what she would reveal next. Inside the kitchen, the atmosphere sharpened instantly, the chef already preparing space before she even spoke, because word had traveled faster than sound. It always did in places like this, and when Zariah outlined the course, her voice low but precise, there was no confusion, no second-guessing, just execution. Ingredients moved with purpose, timing aligned without question, and within minutes, something began to take shape that was not on any menu, something built not from instruction but from understanding. Back in the dining room, Daniel remained still, but his stillness was no longer passive, it was engaged, his eyes occasionally drifting toward the kitchen doors, then back to the table, as if mapping the sequence of events in his mind, calculating not the outcome but the reasoning behind it, because control for him had always come from knowing, and right now, there was something he did not yet fully know. The surrounding tables had stopped pretending entirely now, subtle glances becoming open curiosity, the quiet acknowledgement that something worth watching was unfolding, and yet no one spoke about it, because the moment demanded silence more than commentary. When the doors finally opened again, the timing felt intentional, not rushed, not delayed, exactly when it needed to be, and Zariah stepped forward carrying the next course, the presentation clean, deliberate, every detail aligned with the description she had given, but more than that, it carried a sense of confidence that did not ask for approval, it assumed it. She placed the dish in front of Daniel with the same controlled motion as before, no unnecessary movement, no added explanation, and then she stepped back just enough to give space without stepping away from the moment. Daniel leaned forward slightly, his attention fully captured now, not by the idea of the dish, but by the consistency of her execution, because consistency meant intention, and intention meant something deeper than coincidence. He studied the plate for a moment longer than expected, his eyes tracing the composition, the balance, the restraint, and then he took his first bite. This time, the reaction was even more subtle, a brief pause, a slight shift in his expression that only someone watching closely would notice, not surprise, not disbelief, but recognition, the kind that comes when something aligns exactly with an unspoken expectation. He set the fork down carefully, not dismissively, and exhaled once, almost imperceptibly, as if acknowledging something internally before speaking. "You did not just recommend this," he said quietly, his voice lower than before. "You anticipated it." And the distinction mattered, because recommendation could be learned, but anticipation required something else entirely. Zariah did not respond immediately, allowing the statement to settle, allowing him to sit in the realization rather than rush past it. And when she did speak, her tone remained unchanged. "People rarely want what they say they want," she said, her words measured. "They want what fits them, whether they can describe it or not." And again, the simplicity carried weight, because it revealed more than it explained. Daniel leaned back slowly, his gaze steady on her, and for the first time that evening, there was no trace of challenge in his posture, only focus, because what stood in front of him was no longer a role to test, but a perspective to understand. He tapped his finger lightly against the table once more, not out of impatience, but thought, and then he asked the question that had been forming beneath everything else. "Where did you learn to see like that?" And it was not asked casually, it was asked carefully, because the answer mattered now. Zariah held his gaze, not with defiance, not with hesitation, but with the same quiet certainty she had carried from the beginning. And for a moment, the noise of the restaurant seemed to fade again, not completely, but enough to frame the exchange, enough to make it clear that whatever came next would not just answer his question, it would redefine it, because the night was no longer about service, it was about understanding, and Daniel Whitmore was beginning to realize that the one thing he had always relied on, control, was no longer entirely his to command. Zariah did not answer immediately, not because she needed time, but because she understood something Daniel was only just beginning to learn, that the value of a response often comes from the space before it, the silence that forces a person to sit with their own question, and in that pause, Daniel Whitmore felt it again, that unfamiliar shift where control did not come from speaking first, but from listening longer. The soft piano continued somewhere in the background, glasses clinked. Conversations resumed in fragments, but at table 12, everything felt contained, as if the rest of the room had dimmed slightly to make space for what was unfolding. Zariah finally spoke, her voice calm, grounded. "I learned by watching," she said, simple words, but delivered with a steadiness that suggested they carried more than surface meaning, and Daniel's eyes narrowed just slightly, not in skepticism, but in focus, because he had built his entire career on observation, on reading markets, people, patterns, and yet what stood in front of him felt like a version of that skill he had not fully considered. "Watching what?" he asked, his tone quieter now, stripped of the earlier edge, because this was no longer a challenge, it was a pursuit of understanding. Zariah shifted her weight just slightly, not retreating, not advancing, simply grounding herself in the moment. "Watching what people reveal when they think no one is paying attention," she replied, her gaze steady. "What they order when they are trying to impress, what they leave untouched when they are honest, how they speak when they believe they are in control." And each sentence landed with quiet precision, not dramatic, not exaggerated, but exact, like pieces of a pattern being laid out in front of him. Daniel leaned back slowly, absorbing it, because none of what she said was unfamiliar. And yet the way she said it reframed something he had always taken for granted, something he had used, but perhaps never examined. Around them, the restaurant continued to orbit the moment, subtle glances, hushed tones, a collective awareness that this was no longer just a difficult guest and a capable server. This was something else, something that did not fit neatly into roles or expectations. Daniel exhaled softly, his fingers no longer tapping, no longer signaling impatience, but resting, still, as if even his movements were recalibrating. "And you apply that here," he said, not as a question, but as a realization. Zariah nodded once. "Every table tells you what it needs," she said. "You just have to listen to the parts that are not being said." And again, the simplicity carried weight, because it revealed a method without calling attention to it. Daniel's gaze lingered on her for a moment longer, and something in his expression shifted again, not dramatically, but enough to register. Because for the first time that evening, he was not evaluating her performance, he was recognizing her perspective. He reached for his glass again, taking a slow sip, his eyes briefly lowering to the table before returning to her, as if aligning his thoughts before speaking. "Most people in this room," he said, his voice measured, "believe they are the ones being observed." A faint pause. "They are not used to being understood." And there was something almost reflective in his tone now, something that suggested he was no longer speaking only about others. Zariah did not respond with agreement or disagreement. She simply held the moment, allowing his words to settle, because she understood that realization, when it is real, does not need to be confirmed, it needs to be experienced. A server passed by in the distance, the soft movement of fabric and glass briefly crossing the edge of the scene, but it did not interrupt the focus. Nothing seemed to now. Daniel leaned forward slightly once more, not to reassert control, but to engage more directly. "Then tell me," he said, his voice lower, more deliberate, "what does this table need?" And the question was no longer rhetorical, no longer layered with challenge. It was genuine, and that alone marked the most significant shift of the night. Zariah met his gaze without hesitation, without performance, just clarity, and for a brief moment, the entire space between them felt suspended, as if the answer would not just define the next course, but the entire direction of what this interaction had become. Because somewhere between the first dismissal and this question, something fundamental had changed. The power that once filled the room had not disappeared, but it had been rebalanced, reshaped, and Daniel Whitmore, whether he admitted it or not, was no longer the only one guiding where this night would go. Zariah did not look away, did not soften the moment, because she understood that questions like this were not about food anymore. They were about truth, and truth, when asked sincerely, does not need decoration. The soft glow of the chandelier reflected off the polished surface of the table, casting quiet shadows that shifted slightly as people moved in the background. But at table 12, everything remained focused, contained within the space between two people who were no longer playing the same roles they had started with. She let the silence breathe just long enough to make the question settle, then answered, her voice even, grounded. "This table does not need to be impressed," she said, each word measured, deliberate. "It needs to be understood." And the distinction landed with more weight than anything louder could have, because it reframed everything that had come before. Daniel's eyes held hers, steady, searching, not for weakness, not for error, but for alignment, because what she said did not challenge him, it revealed him, and there was a difference. He leaned back slowly, exhaling through his nose, his posture no longer rigid, no longer defensive, but thoughtful, as if he was adjusting to a new position he had not anticipated occupying. Around them, the rhythm of the restaurant continued, but it felt distant now, like background noise to something far more precise, more intentional. "And what does that mean?" he asked quietly, not because he did not understand the words, but because he wanted to understand how she meant them. Zariah did not hesitate. "It means you are not here for the food," she said, her tone calm, not accusatory, just clear. "You are here to confirm something." A slight pause, not dramatic, just enough to let the idea land. That control still feels the same, no matter where you go. And the air shifted again, not with tension, but with recognition, because now the conversation had moved beyond service entirely. Daniel's expression did not harden, did not close off, but something in his eyes sharpened, not in resistance, but in awareness, because this was no longer about being right or wrong. It was about being seen, and that is something even the most powerful people are not always prepared for. He tapped his finger once against the table, a habit returning, but softer now, less about impatience, more about thought. "You think that is what this is," he said, his voice low, controlled, but not dismissive. Zariah met his gaze without hesitation. "I do not think," she replied. "I observe." And again, the simplicity carried weight, because it left no room for argument, only reflection. A faint movement at a nearby table drew a glance from someone in the corner, but quickly disappeared, because even those not directly involved could feel the gravity of what was unfolding, the quiet intensity of a conversation that had moved far beyond expectation. Daniel leaned forward slightly, his hands resting together now, no longer spread across the table as if claiming space, but contained, focused. "And if you are wrong," he said again, echoing his earlier question, but this time it was different, not a test, not a warning, but a genuine consideration. Zariah did not rush her response, did not adjust her tone. She simply answered, "Then nothing changes," she said. "But if I am right, then you already know it." And that was the difference. The reason her words did not need to push, because they did not introduce something new. They uncovered something that was already there. Daniel sat back slowly, the faintest shift in his expression betraying something he did not usually show, not uncertainty, not discomfort, but recognition, the kind that does not come from being told, but from realizing. He glanced down at the table for a brief moment, the untouched edges of the dish, the careful placement of every element, then back up at her, and for the first time that evening, there was no distance in his gaze, no separation between roles, just a direct line of attention. "Then show me," he said quietly, not commanding, not challenging, but inviting, and that single shift in tone changed everything. Because the man who had started the night expecting to be served was no longer asking for service, he was asking for something else. Entirely, something he could not control the same way, something that required him to listen instead of lead. And Zariah Cole, standing across from him, did not move, did not react outwardly. But in the stillness of that moment, it was clear that the balance of power had already begun to change in a way neither of them would be able to ignore. Zariah did not move right away, not because she hesitated, but because she understood that what he had just asked for could not be delivered the same way as a dish or a recommendation. It required timing, awareness, and a level of precision that could not be rushed. And for a brief moment, she let the silence expand just enough to make the request real. The low hum of the restaurant returned in fragments, a glass being set down, a quiet laugh from a distant table, the soft rhythm of music, continuing as if nothing had changed. Yet everything at table 12 had already shifted into something far more deliberate. Zariah inclined her head slightly, acknowledging his words without amplifying them. And then she turned once more toward the kitchen, her steps measured, consistent, the same quiet confidence guiding her movement. But this time there was no uncertainty behind her, no hesitation from the staff watching, only focus, because now they were not waiting to see if she would fail. They were waiting to see what she would reveal. Inside the kitchen, she did not speak immediately. She moved with intention, selecting elements not by habit, not by routine, but by alignment, her eyes scanning, her hands steady, as if she were assembling something that existed first in understanding before it existed on the plate. And the chef, watching closely, did not interrupt, did not question, because even he recognized that this was no longer about following a process. It was about executing a perspective. Minutes passed, but they did not feel long. They felt exact, like each second was being used rather than spent. And when Zariah stepped back through the doors again, she carried something different, not just another course, but something that felt quieter, more restrained, almost understated in its presentation, as if it did not need to announce itself to be recognized. She approached the table and placed the plate down with the same controlled motion, no added explanation, no unnecessary detail, allowing the moment to unfold without interference. Daniel leaned forward slowly, his attention immediate, focused not just on what was in front of him, but on what it represented, because by now he understood that nothing she had done had been accidental. He studied the dish, the simplicity of it, the balance, the absence of excess, and something in his expression shifted again, not in surprise, but in recognition, deeper this time, more personal. "This is not designed to impress," he said quietly, almost to himself. And Zariah's response came without delay, not louder, not softer, just clear. "No," she said. "It is designed to reflect." And that single word settled into the space between them with a weight that did not need emphasis. Daniel picked up his fork, his movements slower now, more deliberate, as if he understood that this moment required attention beyond habit. And when he took the first bite, the reaction was not immediate, not visible in the way most people would expect, but it was there, subtle, internal, a pause that lasted just a fraction longer than before, as if something had aligned in a way that went beyond taste. He set the fork down gently, his gaze lowering briefly to the table before lifting back to her. And for the first time that evening, there was no calculation in his eyes, no assessment, just acknowledgement. "You removed everything unnecessary," he said, his voice quieter than it had been all night, and Zariah nodded once. "Because that is what you were trying to do," she replied. And again, the simplicity of her words carried more than explanation. It revealed understanding. A faint shift moved through the room again, not loud, not disruptive, but present, because even those who could not hear every word could feel the change, the difference between a transaction and something far more intentional. Daniel leaned back slowly, his posture no longer commanding, no longer defensive, but open in a way that was rare for someone accustomed to control. And for a moment, he said nothing, not because he had nothing to say, but because he was processing something he had not expected to confront. His fingers rested against the table, still now, no longer tapping, no longer signaling impatience. And when he finally spoke, his voice carried a different weight, not authority, not challenge, but clarity. "You are not serving me," he said, and Zariah held his gaze, steady, unshaken. As the realization completed itself, "You are showing me what I came here to ignore," and in That moment, the balance of the night settled into something undeniable, something neither of them could reverse, because the power that once filled the room had not disappeared, it had been redefined, and Daniel Whitmore, without needing to say it out loud, understood that the one person he had expected the least from was the only one who had seen him the most clearly. The realization did not fade when the words settled. It deepened, spreading through the quiet space between them in a way that neither interruption nor distraction could dissolve, and Daniel Whitmore felt it, not as a loss of control, but as something more precise, more unfamiliar. The awareness that control had never been the same as clarity. The low glow of the restaurant lights reflected faintly in the glass beside him. The soft movement of servers passing by, the distant murmur of conversations returning to normal, yet none of it reached the table the same way anymore, because something at its center had shifted beyond routine. Daniel rested his hand flat against the table, not claiming space, not directing the moment, just grounding himself within it, his gaze steady on Zariah, as if recalibrating the way he saw her, not as part of the system he had entered, but as something outside of it entirely. Most people, he said slowly, his voice quieter now, stripped of the earlier edge, spend their time trying to be seen. A slight pause, not for effect, but for accuracy. You never tried. And there was no accusation in the words, only observation. Zariah did not respond with denial or agreement. She simply stood, her posture unchanged, her presence consistent, because she understood that recognition did not require confirmation. It required space to exist. Daniel exhaled once, his eyes drifting briefly to the plate in front of him, then back up, and when he spoke again, there was something different in his tone, not weaker, not softer, but more exact. That is why you see everything, he said, and this time it was not a question, it was a conclusion. A subtle movement passed through the room again, not loud, not disruptive, but noticeable to those paying attention, because even without hearing the words, they could feel the shift, the difference between a man asserting authority and a man arriving at understanding. Daniel leaned back slowly, his posture no longer fixed in control, but open, reflective, as if he had stepped out of a position he had held for too long without examining it. You knew from the beginning, he continued, his gaze steady, that this was not about service, and there was something almost incredulous in the statement, not because he doubted her, but because he was recognizing how clearly she had seen something he had disguised even from himself. Zariah met his gaze without hesitation, her voice calm, grounded. It was never about service, she said, and the words did not challenge him. They aligned with what he was already beginning to accept. Daniel's fingers shifted slightly against the table, not tapping, not restless, just adjusting, as if even the smallest movements were now intentional. And for a moment, he said nothing, not because he lacked words, but because the ones forming required precision. The soft music in the background seemed to stretch, the rhythm slower, more deliberate, as if the entire room had unconsciously adjusted to the pace of the moment. Then what is it about? He asked finally, his voice lower than before, not demanding, not testing, but seeking, and that shift alone carried more weight than any command he had given earlier in the night. Zariah did not rush her answer, did not fill the space with unnecessary detail. She allowed the question to exist fully before responding, and when she did, her words were simple, direct. It is about what remains when everything else is removed, she said, her tone steady. When there is no performance, no expectation, no need to prove anything. A slight pause, not dramatic, just enough to let the meaning settle. What is left is who you actually are, and the clarity of it did not demand agreement. It revealed it. Daniel's expression shifted again, not visibly to most, but enough to mark the moment, because what she described was not abstract. It was immediate. It was present. It was happening right there at that table. He glanced down once more at the simplicity of the dish, at the absence of excess, and then back to her. And for the first time that evening, there was no separation between the man he presented and the one he was becoming aware of. And you think that is what I came here for, he said quietly, not resisting, not deflecting, but confirming. Zariah held his gaze, unwavering. I do not think, she replied, the same calm certainty as before. I see. And in that moment, The final layer of the exchange settled into place, not with noise, not with declaration, but with a quiet understanding that could not be undone. Because the man who had walked into the room expecting to control everything around him had just encountered the one thing he could not control, and instead of resisting it, he had begun to listen. The words did not need to be repeated. They lingered in the air with a quiet permanence that neither of them tried to break. And for a moment, Daniel Whitmore simply sat there, not as the man who had entered the room expecting to dominate it, but as someone who had finally stopped long enough to recognize what had been in front of him all along. The restaurant continued around them, the rhythm of service, the soft glow of lighting, the distant hum of conversations returning to their usual cadence. Yet at table 12, something had settled into place that would not fade with the night. Daniel's gaze remained on Zariah, not searching anymore, not testing, just present, and slowly, almost imperceptibly, he nodded, not to her, not in acknowledgement of service, but in recognition of truth. And that distinction changed everything. He reached for his glass, pausing halfway as if reconsidering the motion, then set it back down without taking a sip, because even the smallest actions now felt unnecessary when the moment itself required nothing more. Most people spend their lives adding more, he said quietly, his voice steady but different, as if shaped by what he had just come to understand. More noise, more control, more proof. His eyes lowered briefly to the table before returning to her. You removed all of it. And there was no resistance left in the statement, only clarity. Zariah did not respond with agreement. She did not claim credit. She simply stood as she had from the beginning, grounded, composed, unchanged by the shift around her, because she had never been reacting to it in the first place. Daniel exhaled slowly, his posture easing into something that no longer needed to assert itself. And for the first time that evening, the tension that had defined his presence was gone, replaced by something quieter, something more deliberate. I have spent years building rooms where I control every outcome, he continued, not as a confession, but as a realization spoken out loud. And tonight, the only moment that mattered was the one I did not control. And there it was, not defeat, not surrender, but understanding, the kind that does not take anything away. It reveals what was missing. A subtle shift moved through the nearby tables again. People returning to their meals, their conversations, but with a different energy now, as if they had witnessed something they could not fully explain but would not forget. Daniel leaned forward slightly, not to reclaim space, but to meet her where she stood, his voice lower, more precise. What is your name? He asked, not because he needed the information, but because it mattered now in a way it had not before. Zariah met his gaze, her expression unchanged. Zariah Cole, she said, simple, direct, and for a moment, her name carried more presence than any title in the room. Daniel nodded once, absorbing it, as if placing it within a context that had only just become clear to him. And then he sat back again, not retreating, but settling into the understanding that the moment did not require anything further. He did not reach for his phone, did not call for the manager, did not make a gesture that would translate this into transaction or reward, because for once, he recognized that not everything needed to be turned into a result. Instead, he simply said, "Thank you." The words quiet, but exact, not casual, not automatic, but intentional, and that alone carried more weight than anything he had said all night. Zariah inclined her head slightly, acknowledging the words without amplifying them, because she understood something he was only beginning to. That recognition does not need to be expanded, it needs to be held. The moment lingered for a second longer, not stretched, not forced, just complete, and then, as naturally as it had formed, it began to dissolve, the rhythm of the restaurant returning fully, the boundaries of roles re-establishing themselves, but not quite the same as before. Daniel remained seated for a moment after she stepped away, his gaze following her briefly before returning to the table. And in that quiet space, there was no urgency to move, no need to reassert control, just a stillness that had not been there when he arrived. Because sometimes, the most powerful shift does not come from being served, it comes from being seen. And that night, without raising her voice, without asking for recognition, without changing who she was for a single second, Zariah Cole had done exactly that, leaving behind not a performance, not an impression, but a truth that would follow him. Long after he walked out of the room, a truth that no amount of power could replace, because it did not belong to the room. It belonged to the moment he finally understood it.